Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We're going to start, inshallah, with the first study session in a series of study sessions on Divine Link, the Fiqh of Salah. This one, inshallah, will cover the first three chapters from the book. So the first chapter begins with an introduction which defines Salah. So Salah is defined linguistically, that is in the Arabic language, as three things. It's defined as dua and istighfar, which is supplication and seeking forgiveness. It's also defined as forgiveness and mercy. It's inna Allaha malaikatahu yusalluna ala nabi, so they ask forgiveness and mercy for the Prophet ﷺ. And it is also used as a metaphor for a house of worship. Technically, Salah in Islamic law is an act of worship which involves particular statements and actions that are performed in a particular manner and order, that begin with a takbir, that is saying Allahu Akbar, and they end with a taslim, that is saying Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah at the end of the Salah. The history of Salah is that before Islam, the Quran mentions many prophets who prayed and are seen praying or performing Salah. That includes Ibrahim and his children, Musa alayhi salam, Bani Israel, including Isa alayhi salam. And you can see in the Quran that there are many examples of the practices of Salah that are already established. Like, for example, praying in the masjid, praying in the mihrab, which is a private quarter for prayer, praying in their own homes, standing for prayer, making ruku', making sujood, praying in congregation, having dhikr during salah, and even taking off the shoes during prayer, which is something that Musa alayhi salam was commanded to do, and that has been lifted from us. The history of salah in Islam. So, in the beginning of the message of the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet ﷺ and the early companions were commanded to pray once in the morning and once in the evening facing Jerusalem. As time progressed, these ayat of Surah Al-Mudaththir were revealed, which obligated night prayer, Qiyam al-Layl, on the Prophet ﷺ and the companions. This was an obligation that they had for a whole year, after which this obligation was lifted. 3 years before the Hijrah, or 5 years before the Hijrah, depending on the opinion you follow and when Isra and Mi'raj took place, the 5 daily prayers were revealed to the Prophet ﷺ with determined times for each prayer. This happened when the Prophet ﷺ ascended in the Mi'raj, and he talked to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he was given 5 daily prayers that initially started with 50 prayers, but then it was reduced to 5 prayers. Each prayer, though, was only 2 rak'at, and people could talk while they were praying, so it was not a sin to talk while you were praying. After the Hijrah to the Medina, the Qibla changed from Jerusalem to Mecca, and the number of rak'at increased, so that Dhuhr would become 4 rak'at, Asr would become 4, and then Maghrib would become 3, and the Isha would also become 4. And talking was actually prohibited in Salah, so the only speech that was allowed in Salah was that which was prescribed, that was dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like glorifying His name or remembering Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. What is the importance of Salah? Why is Salah important? Well, Salah is the main pillar of Islam, and it is the first obligation upon every Muslim after Shahada. It is prescribed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly in the heavens, as we just said in Isra and Mi'raj. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the Salah directly to the Prophet ﷺ with no intermediary. This is the only obligation that was given directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is the only act of worship for which there is a public call and announcement made before it and for it. It is one of the few acts of worship for which purification is an obligation. All the other acts of worship, like zakah, siyam, even hajj, for the most part, do not need purification. Salah is the only thing that requires you to be pure for the entirety of it. The salah cannot be lifted on a person. We know, even if they're traveling or if they're sick, salah is still mandatory on the person, and is the first thing that will be taken account of on the Day of Judgment. It is the best deed of worship that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written for us, is salah. So who must pray? Well, any Muslim who is male or female has to pray. that Muslim must have reached the age of puberty, and if they don't reach puberty, they have to have at least reached the age of 15, at which point prayer becomes mandatory on them. And lastly but not least, the person must be of sound mind. They must actually understand what's happening to them, what they're saying, for prayer to be obligatory on them. The question that we often face is, do children actually have to pray? The Prophet ﷺ has, in a famous hadith, asked us to command our children to pray at the age of 7, and then to reprimand them if they do not pray by the age of 10. The liability of children not praying at the age of 10 and before puberty is on the parents of the child or the guardians of the children. So abandoning Salah. What happens if you abandon Salah? So if you deny the obligation of Salah, which means that you actually think that Salah is actually not mandatory on you. If you say, oh, you know what, I actually don't need to pray, then the ijma' or the consensus of all the scholars of the schools of fiqh is that you become a kafir, you become a murtid, that is an apostate from Islam, and you have left the fold of Islam. The only exemption that the scholars provide is for a new convert who lacks knowledge about the obligation of prayer and speaks out of ignorance. So what happens if somebody neglects Salah but does not deny it? So they neglect Salah out of laziness, out of, just that they're not that religious, but they don't deny the fact that Salah is an obligation on them. So the scholars of fiqh differ on this. The scholars of the school of Abu Hanifa, the school of Imam Malik and Shafi'i believe that the person is a fasiq, that is, he is a rebellious person and that he's disobedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and that he's committing a major sin. And the scholars of the school of Imam Ahmad and Ahl al-Hadith actually believe that the person who leaves Salah becomes a kafir. He actually has become a murtad. And the hadith that they quote for this is the hadith of Burayda ibn al-Husayb. So what time does prayer come in for each of the Salah? So this is something that we saw in class, and I just want to go over it one more time just to make it abundantly clear to all of us what the different opinions are for when Salah time comes in, what is the preferred time for each Salah, and when does the prayer time end for each Salah. So the horizon is basically, imagine a large flat plane of land where you can see all the way to the edge of your vision. So that would be a flat horizon. So in that situation, you would be an observer standing there. So that's you basically as an observer. And the sun right now cannot be seen because it's nighttime. So what happens is that as the sun moves up, as it starts rising, what happens is you have a false dawn. What happens with the false dawn is that as sunlight goes straight up into the sky, and in the atmosphere it reflects back to the observer. So you might see a streak of white light or light in the sky, in the middle of the sky, and that is the false dawn. That is called al-fajr al-kadhib, which is the false dawn. As the sun continues to move though, and it continues to rise, the true dawn comes in, which is the time for Salat al-Fajr, at which time the light will reflect off the atmosphere and come directly from the edge of this horizon to the observer. As time progresses, Fajr time comes in, it stays in until sunrise. Once the sun has risen, the time for Fajr ends. What is the preferred time to pray Salat al-Fajr? So this is something that the scholars differ upon. The Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad and Imam Malik's opinion is that you pray it in the early time of Fajr when it's still dark outside. The Hanafis believe that you should pray Fajr towards the end of its time. As the sun rises, it continues up until it reaches the highest point, the zenith, which is the meridian, at which point prayer is not allowed. As soon as it passes this meridian, the time for Salat al-Dhuhr starts. The time of Salat al-Dhuhr lasts until the shadow of an object equals its length plus any shadow that was observant or visible at the middle of the day, that is at the meridian. The school of Imam Abu Hanifa differs on this opinion, and they have a different opinion, which is that the shadow must equal twice the length of the object plus the midday shadow for the time for Salat al-Asr to begin. What is the preferable time to pray Salat al-Dhuhr? So the preferable time is that in the summer it should be delayed, and in the winter it should be prayed early during its time. The time for Salat al-Asr begins when the time for Salat al-Dhuhr ends. The question about when does the time for Salat al-Asr end, that is when the sun begins to set. As soon as the sun goes below the horizon, it starts going below the horizon, the time for Salat al-Asr ends. The time for Salat al-Maghrib begins as soon as the sun sets below the horizon. The scholars disagree upon when exactly the time for Salat al-Maghrib ends. The scholars from the school of Imam Malik and some of the early scholars from the school of Imam Shafi'i believe that the time for Maghrib is just enough to make the adhan and iqama along with wudu and pray the Maghrib prayer and the sunnah for Maghrib, and that will be the end. And once that time has passed, the time for Salat al-Maghrib has ended. The scholars from the school of Imam Abu Hanifa, the later scholars from Imam Shafi'i's school, and the scholars from Imam Ahmad's school and the Ahl Hadith scholars all believe that the time for Maghrib lasts until the twilight is seen, or basically until the time of Isha begins. When does the time for Isha begin? When does the time for Salat al-Isha begin? The scholars differ upon this. Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad's opinion is that the time for Salat al-Isha begins when the red twilight is seen. That is, this redness from the sky turns a red color and after sunset, and this redness starts to disappear. That is when this time for Salat al-Isha begins. The Ahnaf believe that when the white twilight occurs, that is, the whiteness from the sky disappears, that is when Isha takes place. The difference between this time, between the red twilight and the white twilight, is around half an hour. The preferable time to pray Salat al-Isha is that the Shafi'is believe that it should be prayed early in its time, and the other scholars believe that it should be prayed later on. It should be prayed as late as possible before the end of the time of Isha. What time does Isha end? The majority of scholars believe that the time of Isha ends when the first third or first half of the night has passed. Imam Abu Hanifa is the only exception to this rule. He believes that the time for Isha lasts all the way until the time for Fajr begins. When is it forbidden to pray Salah? So there are 5 times that it is forbidden to pray. The Prophet ﷺ has stated in a hadith of Uqba ibn Amir radiallahu anhu that he reports that there are 3 times at which the Prophet ﷺ used to forbid us to pray or bury our dead: when the sun begins to rise until it is fully up, when the sun is at its height at midday till it passes the meridian, and when the sun draws near to setting till it sets. So from this, the scholars have derived 5 times at which it is forbidden to pray. The first is after Salat al-Fajr, after the person has prayed Salat al-Fajr. The next is when the sun is actually rising. The third is when the sun has reached its zenith, it's at the meridian point. The fourth is right after Salat al-Asr, and the fifth one is when the sun is actually setting. So the scholars differ on whether or not one can pray after Salat al-Fajr and after Asr. Some scholars believe that it is possible to pray after these 2 salah if there is a need for it. For example, if a person makes wudu and they come into a masjid and they need to pray Tahiyyat al-Masjid, that is the prayer, the 2 rak'at that are prayed when you enter the masjid, and Fajr has passed or Asr prayer has already passed, then they can pray those 2 rak'at. But there is a consensus of the scholars that if the sun is rising or the sun is setting or is at its zenith, prayer should not be performed. The 3rd chapter talks about the adhan and the iqama. What is the adhan? The adhan is a specific call to prayer during the time of prayer to notify people that the prayer time has started. The only exception to this is Salat al-Fajr and Salat al-Jum'ah, for which the adhan might happen before the time of prayer has started. The reward for the adhan is immense, and the Prophet ﷺ said, if people would know what there is of reward in calling for adhan and praying in the first row, they would have to have drawn lots to avoid conflict over them. And the adhan itself was actually seen in the dream of Abdullah ibn Zayd and Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu, and it is a mustahab and highly recommended act. What are the conditions that are required for the adhan? The first condition is that the person who gives the adhan has to be a Muslim and he has to be male. The only exception to this is if there is a female jama'ah, like a female congregation. Some of the scholars allow a female to make adhan for them only. The time of salah has to have started. The adhan has to be given in Arabic, and it has to be loud enough for the people to hear. The order of statements has to be maintained through the adhan, and they cannot be changed. And the adhan cannot be divided up. It must be done by one person from beginning to end. The adhan has to be called once for every salah. The only salah for which there is a difference on this is Salat al-Fajr. For Salat al-Fajr, the school of Imam Malik and Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad is that there should be two adhans for Salat al-Fajr. One that is before the time of Salat al-Fajr, that is to wake people up and get them ready for prayer. And the next one should be when the prayer time has actually come in, when the time for Fajr has actually started. Imam Abu Hanifa maintains, though, that there should be only one adhan when the prayer time has actually come in. The Ahl al-Hadith, or the school of Ahl al-Hadith, believe that there should be two Fajr adhans only if there are two mu'adhins present. Otherwise, there should only be one adhan when the time for Salat al-Fajr comes in. What is the Iqamah? The Iqamah basically is the call to stand up in order to establish prayer. What should the wording of the Iqamah be? What should the wording of the Iqamah be? According to Imam Shafi'i and Imam Ahmad, each statement should be identical to the adhan, but it should be only repeated one time, except qad qamat as-salah, which should be said twice. Imam Abu Hanifa says that it should be identical to the adhan. Imam Malik's opinion is that all the statements, including qad qamat as-salah, should only be said one time. Is the Salat al-Witr obligatory? This is a difference of opinion amongst the scholars. Imam Abu Hanifa believes that it is wajib, that is, it is obligatory on every Muslim. Imam Malik, Shafi'i, and Imam Ahmad believe that it is a sunnah mu'akkada, that it is a recommended sunnah only, and that it is not wajib. Jazakumullahu khairan everyone for watching this study session. I hope it was beneficial to all of you. If you have any feedback for us, please send us an email at almaghrib.seattle@gmail.com. Please also enroll for our next class on May 2nd to May 4th called Deception, a Study of the Shaitan. For more information and details on how to register, please go to almaghrib.org/Seattle. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.